On the rugged edge of the western frontier, where the winds carried dust across the plains and silence often felt heavier than company, there lived a woman named Sarah. She had made her home in a small wooden cabin, nestled against the foothills, far from the nearest town. Life had not been easy on her. Years earlier, tragedy had taken her husband, leaving her to survive alone. She planted her own food, chopped her own firewood, and endured the kind of loneliness that only the wide-open prairie could bring. For years, Sarah had grown used to the solitude. She rose with the dawn, tended her small garden, fetched water from the creek, and cooked simple meals over the fire. Nights were quiet except for the cry of coyotes in the distance or the rustle of the wind through the trees. Yet, deep in her heart, she carried an emptiness. She had known love once, and the silence of her cabin walls often reminded her of what she had lost. One late autumn evening, as Sarah was preparing her supper, the distant thunder of hooves shook the ground. At first, she thought it was a storm rolling over the plains, but soon, the sound grew louder and clearer. 7 Comanche riders, tall and fierce in their bearing, approached her cabin. She froze for a moment, unsure whether to bar the door or step outside. These were men of a proud nation, known across the frontier for their strength and skill. When the riders came to a halt, their leader raised his hand in peace. He spoke respectfully, asking for shelter from the cold wind sweeping across the prairie. Sarah hesitated but could not turn them away. Hospitality, even in times of uncertainty, was something her late husband had taught her to honor. She opened her door, and the 7 warriors entered, grateful for warmth and food. The cabin, once silent, was filled with voices that night. The men spoke in low tones among themselves, sharing stories in their native tongue while Sarah stirred the stew over the fire. For the first time in years, the glow of her hearth shone on more than just empty chairs. She offered them bread and venison, and they accepted with gratitude. Among the 7 was a younger warrior named Tahu. He was quieter than the rest, his sharp eyes watching Sarah with curiosity. Unlike the others, who laughed and spoke boldly, Tahu treated her with a quiet respect. He noticed how she moved with grace despite the hardships of her life, how her hands were worn yet strong, and how her loneliness seemed to hang around her like an invisible cloak. Over the next days, the riders stayed as the weather turned harsher. Sarah found herself speaking more with Tahu, who asked about her life, her garden, and the land she called home. Though their worlds were vastly different, they found common ground in survival, resilience, and the silent understanding of loss. She learned that Tahu had also lost much, family and friends to war and disease, and that his strength came not from pride alone, but from pain carried deep within. Slowly, a bond began to form. Sarah felt her heart stir in a way it had not for years. She had never expected companionship again, much less from someone so different from herself. Yet, under the same roof, sharing firelight and conversation, walls of loneliness began to crumble. Tahu, too, seemed drawn to her gentleness, her quiet courage in the face of solitude. When the time came for the warriors to leave, Sarah felt an ache she could not ignore. She had grown used to their presence, and the thought of her cabin falling silent again weighed heavy. As the riders prepared to mount their horses, Tahu lingered. He stepped closer, his voice low but steady. He told her that though the prairie was wide, he would return. Sarah stood at her cabin door, watching as the riders disappeared into the horizon, her heart no longer as lonely as before. She knew life had changed that week. A woman who had lived alone for years had opened her door to strangers, and in doing so, had opened her heart once more. Somewhere out on the plains rode a Comanche warrior who had seen her not as a lonely widow, but as a woman strong enough to stand against the silence of the frontier. And he had fallen for her. It was a promise unspoken, but Sarah believed it with all her heart. The next time the sound of hooves thundered toward her cabin, it would not bring loneliness, but love.